Welcome back. This is the Catholic Lady, and we're reading Great Lion of God by Taylor Caldwell. If you're following along, Saul just found out that Jesus was risen from the tomb, and he didn't take it very well. He doesn't believe it at all. And he sent away his cousin with disgust. He now doesn't trust his own sister and Joseph of Arimathea, whom he loves, and his cousin. He believes all of them were deluded. So we'll continue now with chapter 27. Saul, in his young manhood, had become mistrustful of his own subjective apprehensions, emotions, and observations. For as Rabban Gamaliel had often told him, it is a fallacy, and often a dangerous one, to expect others to accept our subjective conclusions and experiences as objective facts. Therein lies peril, as the history of good men has often illustrated, for good men convinced that their subjective convictions have verity, have sought to impose them on others with considerable violence and enthusiasm, and this was frequently led to massacres, cruel and oppressive laws, coercions, despotisms, and universal madness. Saul, who had tended his own nature to excess and positive affirmations, or negative ones, equally intense and violent, reluctantly had to admit that the Rabban had been quite correct. He practiced self-discipline at all times, sometimes successfully and sometimes with no success at all. He now had a wary mistrust of his subjective impressions, suspecting that he threw the shadow of his mind on reality and called it a fact which should surely be obvious to other men. Yet when he entered Jerusalem, his senses, or his intuitions, or his imagination, led him to believe that the city had changed in some indescribable and subtle way. As he was driven through the streets in a car he had engaged at Joppa, he saw, or thought he saw, a certain stillness that permeated all things, even the market rabble, and that the light had altered. He told himself that this was absurd. He had expected some change, and his imagination had obliged him. But was that not a different aspect on faces now? A thoughtfulness? Were the markets and the narrow rising and the winding streets less noisy? Was it possible that a city had a life of its own, secret from men, and that its vast and hidden thoughts metaphorphed the very air, the angles of light, the cast of shadows, and made men vaguely aware of them? It was late summer, and the hills and fields were golden with the coming harvest, and the distant mountains were a deep pulsing purple, and the twisting walls of Jerusalem had to Saul's eye a deeper and brighter yellow than he had ever seen before. Still, he remembered no day or night or even hour was the same as the one preceding it, and in nearly a year Jerusalem must have inexorably altered. That was what the traveler discerned. The inhabitants did not observe. He went first to his shop on the street of the tent makers. Had it always been so narrow, so dark, so ill-smelling, and so subdued? The rattle and the clang of the looms was loud now, when the voices in the shops louder now than the voices in the shops. Had it been that way before? He dropped his few pouches and his one small chest and looked about the dusty gloom of his own shop with a sense, not of homecoming, but of exile. He shook out his blankets, and they smelled musty. He pushed open shutters. The mice had been busy here and there, and he cursed them. He went to the nearest market, and standing on the black cobblestones, he drank some poor wine and ate some cheese and bought a grape leaf heaped with hot and steaming spiced meat. A merchant was arguing nearby with another miserable merchant, and though they were hidden from Saul by the wall of their little shop, he could hear them clearly. "I tell you, he was truly the Messiah." "Quiet! You will be accused like him of blasphemy and heresy, or of incitement against Rome. If the priests don't seize you by the neck, the Romans will." "You were laughing at me, but I say to you again that I saw him send light and sight into the clouded eyes of a blind man who had his station at the wall of the temple begging." "I have heard of this from many of our penniless rabbis in the past. Is that all the proof you have?" the merchant chuckled. "No, it was something else. I saw his face. I knew him for the Messiah. My heart told me. My soul quivered." "If you do not tend the fire, your meat will quiver into cinders." There was a muttered cursing, a wave of smoke that bellied out into the street, a stench of overcooked meat. Saul was frowning and eating without awareness. Titus Milo-Platonius had said the same thing. "I saw his face, and I knew him for the Messiah." The merchant said, panting and choking somewhat, "Laugh if you will, Amos, but it was true, and one day you will know it is true." Saul walked slowly past the shop, and with pretended unconcern glanced within it, to see two burly men with white and black headcloths and garments chopping meat and seasoning it on a plank of wood not too clean, and mixing it with onions and stirring it in pots. Their hands were soiled and their nails grimy. Saul dropped his grape leaf on the stones. He still idled. He caught the odor of the men, rank and tinged with garlic, and he saw their heat-flushed, coarse faces and their big red mouths. He smiled darkly to himself. From among these, Yeshua of Nazareth had drawn his followers. He was welcome to them and to their base, vulgar acceptance of him. There were only a few men of family, like Joseph of Arimathea and his cousin Milo, who had been so deceived. He returned to his shop, bathed, put on his better clothing, and went to the house of his grandfather, Shabuah ben Abraham. He had bought in Tarsus gifts for his sister and her 5 children, and in spite of his frugality, he had spent considerable money. He had also brought a tithe for the temple in Jerusalem, as was customary. The gift for his sister was a flexible golden serpent with ruby eyes and a glittering tongue to be worn on the arm, a silly Egyptian trifle in his estimation, but one sure to please Sephora. For her children, he had bought golden small replicas of the Ark of the Covenant, piously inscribed and excellently wrought. It came to him, as he placed them in a pouch, that he had bought nothing for Sephora's husband, that silent, gentle young man with the lake blue eyes. Saul was annoyed, but one easily overlooked Ezekiel, who never had anything to say for himself. For his favorite of Sephora's children, Amos ben Ezekiel, he had made a special gift, an ornate cap of black, red, and white, signifying the tribe of Benjamin, elaborately bordered with gold embroidery and heavily inset with precious jewels. At the top was a round fringed circle of blue, the sign of the Pharisee. The expensive thing was not to Saul's taste, but immediately he saw his sister's face, he knew that he had delighted her. She put it on Amos's fair curls and stood off to admire it. The boy smiled at her indulgently, though he was now a man, according to Jewish tradition. He still wore the purple-bordered tunic of an adolescent. Saul, at his request, made in a letter to Clodia Flavius, was admitted to the women's quarters of his grandfather's house. He knew that the Roman lady had granted him a rare privilege. Men were rarely admitted to the women's quarters by ladies of propriety, and only on specific invitation, though women, if they desired, could invade the rest of the house. Clodia had told Sephora, "Men are very, very tedious and vain and childish, and a woman of sense can endure them only infrequently. Hence the ladies of my generation, and all true ladies even in these degenerate times, adhere to the old ways of a woman's sanctuary." Sephora's two older sons, Amos and his brother of 14 years, were received in these plain but pleasant quarters only for certain hours of the afternoon. Within a short time they could not enter except on special occasions and on invitation. The younger boys, still children, and the little maid lived in the women's quarters with their mother and their grandmother. Clodia Flavius had become plump and even more sedate over the years, though her eyes were still clear and observant and mildly severe. She sat in an ebony chair near Sephora, who everyone believed was now a most decorous young matron. But her golden eyes were still dancing and merry and eloquent as she looked at her beloved brother, though her hair, bright as gilt, was concealed by a headcloth. Her clothing was modest and demure. She sat with her hands folded patiently in her lap. Saul, for the first time in his life, approved of her, though he had never ceased to love her. He had come here for a definite purpose, and Clodia sensed it within a few moments, and she looked at him openly and waited. Saul drew Amos to him, and with a gentle but peremptory hand, and the boy stood at his knee and looked at him with Hillel's soft brown eyes, which had an inner radiance of intelligence. Amos was tall and slender, with a beautiful strong mouth and a complexion of rose. So Hillel must have looked in his youth, thought Saul, with the familiar pain at his heart. "I should like to ask you a few questions, my nephew," he said, and he glanced at Sephora. "Will your grandmother's and mother's permission?" "With your grandmother's and mother's permission." Clodia's thick eyebrows twitched, and Sephora bent her head serenely. "I was told of your illness before the Passover," said Saul, and now he looked steadily into the boy's eyes. "Tell me, did you eat anything peculiar or drink it before your illness? Anything that your brothers and your sister did not eat?" The boy shook his head, puzzled. But suddenly Clodia and Sephora exchanged a quick look and leaned forward in their chairs. Still fixing the boy with their fierce and commanding blue eyes, Saul said, "The servant, the old man Cephalus, the Greek, did he not give you a sweetmeat or a pastry before your illness, or a cup of wine which your brothers and your sister did not share?" "No, my uncle," said Amos. "Cephalus does not come to these quarters, and I did not leave them before my bar mitzvah, though sometimes I saw Cephalus from a distance. I have spoken to him but 3 times in my life." "When?" The word was as sharp as the crack of the whip. "Once when I was very young," said Amos, the puzzled frown still between his eyes. "And I had strayed into the garden of my grandfather's house, Shabuah ben Abraham. He returned me, he carried me over his shoulder like a lamb, and I saw him after that a year ago, when he delivered a message to my grandmother from my grandfather, David ben Shabuah." Amos paused. "And the 3rd time?" The boy moved uneasily at the intent questioning. He was afraid of Saul, who could be very intimidating. "After my illness, Saul ben Hillel." Saul clasped his hands over his knees and studied the youth grimly, as if doubting his every word, and Amos looked back at him with increasing uneasiness. Once he glanced at his mother, who had become pale and still. "Tell me," said Saul, "did you ever accept any dainty or wine, or even a cup of water, or a fruit, from any other member of my grandfather's house, from any servant who came to you secretly and quietly and offered it to you, and ate or drank apart from your brothers and your sister?" "No," said Amos. He was now clearly alarmed at this interrogation, the lawyer's intensive interrogation which had frightened others older than he in the past. His underlip quivered, and he caught it quickly between his teeth and remembered that he was no longer a child. Saul sat back in his chair, but his daunting eyes did not leave the boy's face. He studied him even more grimly. "Perhaps you forget," he said, and the boy shook his head. "Are you implying, Saul ben Hillel, that my grandson was deliberately poisoned or drugged?" asked Clodia Flavius. "If so, you are in error." Saul did not look at her. He still gazed at his nephew. "Amos, how long did you feel languid or indisposed before you fell into that great illness?" The boy suddenly looked sheepish, and Saul leaned toward him. "Waiting? For 2 weeks, perhaps," confessed Amos. "But I had told no one, fearing that the festivities attending my bar mitzvah would be delayed, and I would pass the occasion on my bed. I did not desire that, but I was stricken at last 3 days before, and from that day I remembered nothing." "Nothing?" The word was relentless. The boy's white eyelids fell over his eyes. "I remember nothing of my illness, except for an hour before I became unconscious. I believed I was dying. My fever consumed me like flames, and my head was like cracking stone, and I could not even drink water. Then all became dark." "Ah," said Saul. "Remember, Amos, remember. During those weeks, did you eat or drink anything strange and alone? A berry in the garden, perhaps, which not even birds eat, or a root or a fruit you found, or an enticing sweetmeat left idly on a seat in the garden." Now Saul's own quick temper suffused the boy's cheeks, and his eyes sparkled, and not with alarm. "Saul ben Hillel," he said in a firm voice, "I am not an infant. I do not put chance articles into my mouth, nor am I an idiot who thrusts odd meats between his lips." Clodia smiled tightly, and Sephora, looking at her again, also smiled. "You are disrespectful," said Saul. "Your deportment has been neglected. I am your uncle, and I have a serious reason for questioning you, for do I not love you? And it is not my wish to protect you from evil superstitions and delusions and the enticements of dark spirits? Therefore, answer me without imprudence or quickness, and be temperate. Tell me, you fell into a stupor of illness and fever. Do not remember your illness, which lasted 3 days. What is your next memory?" But to Saul's own surprise, the boy became silent, and an indescribable expression appeared on his fair face, and a melancholy, and a curious sadness. Saul took his hand, and it had become cold and faintly tremulous. "Tell me, Amos ben Ezekiel, for I hold you dear and would not have you harmed. Has anyone asked you this question before?" "No," whispered the boy, and now his lips were trembling. "So it is that I ask you," said Saul. "I dreamed," said Amos, and tried to take away his hand, but Saul held it strongly. "Of what did you dream?" "It is lawful," said Clodia Flavius in her sturdy Roman voice, "to question of these things, Saul ben Hillel." "Is it lawful?" asked Clodia Flavius in her sturdy Roman voice, "to ask of these things, Saul ben Hillel?" "It is," said Saul, still not looking at her. "For the sake of the boy's soul, I am not inquisitive. I know the Kabbalah. I know why I question. Amos, of what did you dream?" The boy uttered a deep sigh, and was almost a moan. "I woke in a beautiful country, more beautiful than any vista in Israel." His voice was hushed and low. "There were mighty ivory and gold mountains in the distance, shining though I did not see the sun. The sky was very blue, and between me and the mountains there was vast valleys and gardens and many quiet trees and flowers, and the air was full of singing. But I saw no singers. I stood on the bank of a river as green as grass and swiftly flowing. It seemed very deep and wide, and on the farther shore. Yes, said Saul. The room was completely silent now. My grandfather stood there, Hillel ben Baruch, in white garments that were like light. I knew him at once, for I had seen him before he died. Now the boy looked directly into Saul's eyes, not defiantly, but with a demand that he be believed. It was a man's imperative gaze, stern and reserved. Saul was much moved, despite his growing anger and his convictions that the boy had been secretly drugged by a servant, a follower of Yeshua of Nazareth, in order to create just this occasion. I believe that you dreamed you saw my father, Amos. But the boy's voice rose clear and decisive. I did not dream, my uncle. I saw him, and he smiled at me, and I beckoned to me. But the river lay between us, and then he lifted his hand, and the river narrowed to the width of a brook, and he stretched his hand to me. And I took it, and I stepped over the brook, and we laughed together, and watched the river widen again. His words were now loud